All right, for Friday. Friday, I have Macklin Tower, room 205 set up. It's going to be on the video now, which is going to be posted. I'm going to send out an email. This is actually the second floor of the library, and I will have the room available from 9:30 to 1:30. So classes basically go from 10 to 1. If you're in the early class, you want to come in early. If you're in the last class and you want to stay a little bit later. If you want to come in for all 4 of the hours, whatever it would be, Macklin Tower 205. It's the second floor in the library. It's one of those study rooms. And I've got about 40 or 45 chairs in there, so there will be room for y'all.
What are the times for it again?
9:30 to 1:30. Many of you are just going to take your exam during regular class time, and that's totally fine. Like I said, if you want to start earlier, if you want to stay later, as long as it's within 9:30 to 1:30, that's fine. I'm going to post these videos, and I'll have links in there. And basically what I'm looking at is probably about 30 multiple choice questions, and then probably about 30 points of short answers. So it's probably going to be roughly about a 90-point exam, maybe 85, plus the 22 points from the reading quiz, and that's how you'll get the final grade. It'll be a little bit over 100 is basically what we're looking at. Now, for today, it's basically terms and articles. Terms and articles. None of the reading questions are going to be on there. Nothing from the reading quiz is going to be on there. But these are the terms, and we'll remove some of these today, and then the articles. And the articles should be pretty much updated. Why don't we start with the terms, and let's start with Chapter 1. Have y'all got any questions about any of the terms from Chapter 1?
What's 111?
111, yeah, I need to change this at some point. This is actually, I think, supposed to be 114, and this is the number of peaceful midterm and presidential elections in American history, and that's what that is. So, since I made the study guide, evidently we've had 2 or 3 more elections. But it should be 114, the number of peaceful midterm and presidential elections in American history. What else do y'all have? Who? Who is actually dealing with the Declaration of Independence? And if you remember when I had gone through this, I had mentioned to y'all who wrote it, who was it written for, who was it written about. Who was it that wrote it? Thomas Jefferson is considered the father of the Declaration. If you go back in there and you watch the Schoolhouse Rock video on it, it mentions some others in there. It mentions Livingston, it mentions Franklin, it mentions some others. You could really impress me with that. Who was it written about?
The king of...
The king. Why do you say the king?
Because he was controlling the colonies and he was giving them unfair taxes. And
What was the word that was repeated over and over?
property?
He endeavored to prevent, he obstructed, and it was all of these negative words. So they wrote it, and effectively what they did is they gave a list of grievances specifically against the king. Who was it written for? Allies. Who said that? What do you mean by allies?
People that I guess, separate from the king.
Yeah, exactly. And what was the number 1 ally that basically bid on it?
The French.
The French were, yeah. A lot of people will say it was for the people. And when I had given this to y'all, I think I read it off, and then I called on somebody, and I was like, hey, what does this mean? And people oftentimes give me blank looks. Y'all are in college. Y'all are a little bit more educated than probably a lot of those folks would have been back then. They probably wouldn't have understood it. But, so it wasn't for the people, or they were so upset because they had been oppressed, taxed, different things like this. It was really for potential allies. And what was the overall purpose behind it? Go ahead, Jefferson. A legal justification for separation from Great Britain. So keep these things in mind. And don't forget stuff like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and property, because we went through this. And there's a quote that was actually in there, and I think it was somewhere around page 24 or something. And the quote in there, it's about 10 lines, basically breaks down everything that you would really kind of need to know about the Declaration. And I'll pull this up because it's right in the outline. And this quote actually starts talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The quote begins to talk a little bit about that the people had the right to overthrow a government if the government was not actually looking out for them effectively. You know, these kinds of things. And I guess that quote was probably on page 21. So as far as that quote from the Declaration, it was in the upper right-hand corner. What other questions have y'all got? And let's just focus on chapter 1 before we get into chapter 2. What other questions do y'all have? Go ahead, jump here.
Political science and end of a term.
Political science, I wouldn't worry about that one. I'm not going to ask you on that one.
Okay.
Okay? Others?
I mentioned end of a term.
And
Of a term.
I don't know what
Oh.
word you're saying.
Never mind, like I.
Okay. Other questions? Go ahead, Marty.
I had a question about the long-term issue.
The long term.
Like, it's like political.
That's not going to be on there. Don't even worry about it. What other questions from these terms do y'all have? Because these are the terms that are going to be on the exam. Go ahead, Levi.
Direct democracy.
What was direct democracy? There was direct democracy, there was representative democracy, and I had mentioned to y'all that in the United States we have representative democracy. Go ahead, Nikon.
Wasn't direct democracy where the people voted on everything?
Direct democracy is the idea that the people vote on everything. And the basic idea is that, you know, representative democracy, you elect politicians, politicians vote for you. Direct democracy is the idea that the people vote on everything and you kind of skip the idea of politicians. Now there's two words up here. There's recall and there's initiative that are examples of direct democracy. Do you recall what an initiative was? Oh, it's going to be a fun test on Friday. Anybody remember what an initiative was? Because I believe I had asked y'all in class, if you wanted to get a bill passed, what would you do? And if your elected representative wouldn't do anything for you, then what could you do? And if the senator wouldn't do anything, none of the elected politicians, what could you do?
Recall.
Not a recall, actually an initiative. The initiative is the idea where you would actually go and you would draft a bill, and then you would need to get signatures from a percentage of registered voters in the state. And then when the Board of Elections verifies that these are registered voters, then this bill that you've drafted is basically, the statement really that you drafted is going to be a yes or a no question. And if at that point more people vote yes than no, then your idea passes and it becomes law. This is an example of direct democracy because there's no politicians. You wrote it, people signed it, people voted on it. Direct democracy is the people making law. You, Lex, had mentioned recall. Any idea what recall was?
When citizens can remove someone from power.
Oftentimes when you go to the polls to vote, you vote to put somebody into office. A recall is actually where you are having a special election to remove somebody. Lexi, do you remember how you get a recall started? Does anybody remember? Go ahead, Gloria.
I think you have to get enough signatures.
Yeah, you're actually gonna set up just like an initiative. An initiative, you're writing a bill, writing a law, if you will. In this one, you're actually just writing to have a proposal to remove somebody from office. And you would have to get, exactly like you said, that percentage of voters that said, yes, we should have a recall election. With a recall election, number one, with a recall election, you don't have to have committed anything that is illegal. In fact, you can just come on in. I thought somebody wanted to come in. You can actually, you don't have to do anything illegal. You can actually just vote to remove somebody from office. So they made bad decisions. Do you remember the example that I had given you from class?
Arnold.
What's that?
Arnold.
Arnold Schwarzenegger from California. Do you remember who the governor was? It wasn't Al Gore. It was a color.
Blue.
Gray Davis was the governor, and Gray Davis had, yeah, that's going to be on tape now. You got to be careful what you say. Gray Davis was the governor, and in fact, he had made some spending mistakes as far as allocating state money. They decided that they wanted to remove him. So the first thing, and there's two questions. You know what the two questions are on a recall ballot? Go ahead.
The first one was, do you still want the representative or whoever to still be in office?
Do you want to recall or remove, in this case, Gray Davis from office? And if you answer no, you're done. But if you answer yes, then what have you got to do?
Then you gotta choose from the list of people who are running for office. elected?
Exactly. The second question is, who do you want to replace? So if you answer no, then you're done. You're basically voting for Gray Davis to stay. If you vote yes, then you've got to pick the replacement. Do y'all remember, in addition to Arnold, some of the people that were on that ballot? Go ahead.
Wasn't one a stripper or something like that?
One of them was actually a porn star. Mary Carey Cook was. Any others that you can think of?
Sumo wrestler.
There was actually a wrestler. There was. Any others?
Wasn't it that one exercise guy? Forgot his name. But
Richard Simmons, yeah, it may have been Richard Simmons, the exercise, it may have just been an attorney, but somebody named Richard Simmons was on there. Gary Coleman was on there, if you remember. Angeline, the stripper, was on there. Larry Flint was on there of Hustler magazine. There were some celebrities, basically direct democracy is ruled by all the people, and it's funny, oh yeah, I like direct democracy. Then we start talking about strippers and governors ruling. And then all of a sudden, y'all didn't seem to like that idea as much. And ultimately, Schwarzenegger was elected that way. Make sure that you're comfortable with recall. Anything else that jumps out from chapter 1? Go ahead.
So is initiative like the same thing as a petition, pretty much, or is there something?
You know, I don't want to classify it, and I don't want to get too far into it, but just make sure that you know that with the initiative, you're basically drafting something, you're collecting the signatures, and then ultimately it's going to get put to a yes or no vote. And I don't mean to cut you off, it's
Okay,
just,
okay.
I don't want to get anybody confused with terms for the exam. Lexi, go ahead.
Do we need to know anything about like the plans, like the New Jersey plan?
They are actually in chapter 2, and I'm assuming now that we don't want to do anything else with chapter 1. So what's your question?
Oh, never mind. I just didn't see it here.
Go ahead, Gloria.
So what is who? The last one for chapter 1?
Oh, that's already on the video. So if you'll watch that, I promise it really is already on there. Other questions? Let's look at the articles. And the articles are going to be a big deal. Please, 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 don't blow these off. And actually, let me get back into chapter 1 on this. Chapter 1, there were 3 articles. Do y'all remember those 3?
Yeah, with the Texas State cheerleaders.
The Texas cheerleaders was one.
The sex shop patrons and the Catholic school.
Yeah. What do y'all remember about the Catholic school teacher?
Michelle McCusker.
Michelle McCusker, yes. What happened to her?
She was pregnant, but she got pregnant out of wedlock, and she went to the dean, whatever you would have called it.
Principal.
Yeah, principal, and confessed to being pregnant, and then the principal had told her that she had to get married, but it didn't have to be to the father of the child; it had to be just to any man. And then 3 days later, then she was fired because she didn't uphold the contract or whatever.
What did the contract say?
That she to uphold the core Catholic values.
Had to uphold the core teachings of the Catholic Church. Understand on this, Michelle McCusker was, I think in her late 20s, she got pregnant out of wedlock, and she did actually come forward. She came forward about the time that she was going to begin to show anyway, though. And when she came forward at this point, she admitted it. Principal said exactly what you said, and probably extended her a courtesy by saying, hey, listen, you got to get married to somebody. Doesn't have to be the real father, but you got to get married to somebody. And ultimately she did it, and ultimately she was fired. Core teachings of the Catholic Church is what the contract said in this. And so the school fired her basically because she had violated the contract. What was it, in fact, her argument? Anybody? Go ahead.
She said it was discrimination because since if a man were to have sex and get somebody pregnant out of wedlock, he wouldn't be able to tell. And then go through the court ruling.
She said that she was discriminated, basically, this was a discrimination issue, and it was a discrimination issue as a pregnant woman. And so she is kind of playing a little bit on gender, which would be the discrimination issue, but pregnant kind of raises that a little bit higher even in terms of maybe people thinking, you know what, you really shouldn't be doing this to a pregnant woman kind of thing. With that being said, so you had 2 cases, or 2 claims here. One was she broke the contract. The other was she was being discriminated against because a man could do the same thing and not be treated the same way because people wouldn't know. What was the court ruling? Go ahead.
The court ruled that because since plenty of women have sex out of wedlock and don't get pregnant, then it was perfectly legal for her to be fired because it was and it wasn't discrimination.
They said on there that if women, not all women that have sex get pregnant, just like men that have sex don't get pregnant. So the women that had sex and didn't get pregnant and the men that didn't get pregnant, none of them were getting fired. Their ultimate point was she went in there and told. And if a man would have gone in there and told that he had done the same thing, he would have been fired just like she was. Ultimately, they said you did break the contract, you didn't uphold core teachings of the Catholic faith. As such, you are legally terminated. And if you remember, I put a link in there, and the link that was in there actually deals with the anti-gay clause that would seem to fall outside of core teachings of the Catholic faith as well. Sex shop patrons, what do you remember about that one? Go ahead, Gloria.
It was right across the street from the church, so when
What was right across the street from the church?
The sex shop, or no, the whatever it was. So when they
The sex shop or whatever it was.
Whatever,
Yeah, the
like,
sex shop.
what
Let's go.
was
So when we talk about sex, we're talking about like movie stores, or you get the idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, it was across the street from a church, or next to a church.
Yeah, kind of both. Yeah.
Okay, but either way, so there were like condoms and stuff and magazines in the church parking lot. So when they came to church in the morning, they had to see that and clean it up and stuff. So what they did was take pictures of the people's license plates,
yeah.
because it's public records in whatever state
Yeah.
that was, I think Texas.
Texas, yeah.
So then they mailed that to the person's house and let them know that, hey, we know you're here and stuff like that. Basically like blackmailing them to not come back.
Did they say on the postcard